All right, hey everyone out there in Banjo land, Mike Heading here. Got a little mini lesson for you today on how to find and create melodies. I get a lot of questions from students. Maybe you've started going to jams and you're having to take solos on songs that you've never heard before. Someone calls a song in a jam, you've never heard the song. How do you find the melody, or how do you play something that will work for that song? Obviously, this is a skill you got to practice, but what I want to give you with this lesson is a few ideas on how to narrow the search, right? If you're just looking on the entire fretboard and say, okay, the melody could be any of these notes on the entire fretboard, that's obviously going to be very overwhelming and it's going to be hard to know where to start, right? So I want to give you a few tips and tricks on how to narrow down your search for where that melody might be. And again, you can apply this to finding a melody to a song you're just learning, or you can use it eventually to create your own melodies. All right, let's jump into it. Here we go. Okay, so before we get into some examples, let's just do a little bit of music theory. This will really help you out, and understanding these terms can go a long way in helping you narrow down the melody. You might know a lot of this stuff, but you just haven't connected it in your mind yet. So this is where a little bit of music theory can be helpful. So we need to understand three terms: chord tones, passing tones, and non-scale tones, okay? So chord tones are the notes that make up the chord. You've probably heard that your banjo is tuned to an open chord, right? G. So each of these open notes are going to be the chord tones, the tones that make up the chord, okay? If you're in C, right? If you play a C chord, the notes that you play, doesn't matter where you're doing it on the neck, what inversion, those chords are going to be made up of chord tones, okay? Same thing, D, it doesn't matter major or minor, right? Chords are built with chord tones, okay? Probably, even if you haven't connected or used that term, it makes sense, right? The specific notes that build those chords are called the chord tones, okay? You also have a scale, right? So if you're in G, you might have heard someone say like, oh, you should learn the G major scale. But that's not necessarily going to help you find melodies right off the bat unless you know how to use it. So the chord tones are also going to be in that scale, but there's other notes in that scale called passing tones, right? So we have a chord tone, passing tone, chord tone, passing tone, chord tone, and then two passing tones, and then another chord tone, right? So you have chord tones, passing tones, and then you have the third option, which would be like non-scale tones, which are just notes outside of that aren't either passing tones or chord tones. In this example, like those notes, again, they're not in the G major scale, and they're not a chord tone, right? They might be in a different scale that you might eventually want to use, but if you're thinking in major, most bluegrass songs are either in a major or minor key, right? Those notes would be outside of the scale, and they're not passing tones, so they'd be non-scale tones. Okay, so how do you use this, right? So the best analogy I think I've come up with is, and you kind of have to picture this in your mind, is if you've ever seen one of those like rock climbing walls. I don't know if you've ever been to like the YMCA or REI or maybe your high school had one, right? One of those big rock climbing walls, and it's got different routes you can go up. And some of the holds are bigger and some of them are really small and tiny, right? There's different shapes and sizes, right? So this is how you think about it. So the chord tones are the really safe ones that you can grab onto where you can always get a really good hold. The passing tones are going to be a little bit smaller, but you can still grab onto them. And the non-scale tones are going to be really tiny, and you really kind of only want to hold on to those for a little bit, right? Before you're going to feel like you're falling off, right? So if you're grabbing onto chord tones when you're making your melody, plain chord tones are going to be really safe, and you're going to be able to easily grab hold. It's going to be a strong connection to the chords that the band or the jam is playing. The passing tones, like I said, are going to be smaller. You might want to grab onto one of those while you're getting to your next chord tone, right? So again, you're using them in passing. And the non-scale tones are going to be the least safe, right? You're only going to want to grab onto those for a quick second, or it's going to feel like you're getting off of that chord. The melody is going to get outside of, again, kind of what you would call maybe a safe melody, okay? So why would you not want to play chord tones only, right? So you might think, well, I'll just stay on the chord tones the whole time, right? So The downside of that is it's always going to be, again, think of the analogy of rock climbing, right? It's always going to be really, really easy if you just go up the safe route every time. It might get a little bit boring. So you're eventually going to want to introduce those passing tones or non-scale tones to spice up, to give your melodies more life and more expression. And I'll show you that in an example. If we only play chord tones, you'll see we're coming up with a very quote-unquote safe melody, but it might not be that interesting. So that's what you need to remember is melodies are going to almost always start on a chord tone and then use passing tones to connect chord tones together. So, okay, so let's look at our banjo now and kind of use that in practice. So let's say I only use chord tones. Even if I add some slides, right? So maybe I go like, you can hear I'm playing all chord tones there, and it does sound like a little bit of a melody, but it's not what you would, I wouldn't say it's that interesting, right? It kind of sounds very generic. It does sound very safe, so that's a good spot to start, but that's a great way to start with a break, right? You want to start on one of those chord tones. Or maybe I start my break here. Or I start here, right? So if I'm learning a song that I've never heard, I'm always going to start on one of those chord tones, especially if I'm playing bluegrass. Maybe if you're doing jazz or something, it might start on a different degree of the scale. But in bluegrass, it's almost always going to start on one of those safe chord tone notes. So think about it, right? There's 3 chord tones that make up the major scale, or a major chord rather, excuse me. Three notes that make up, in this case in G, you got G, B, and D. Doesn't matter where you're playing them on the neck, right? Those are the 3 chord tones that build the G major chord. So think about it, if you're learning a song you never heard, if I start on one of those, I have a 33% chance right off the bat of hitting the right melody note. And if I pick one of the other 2 that's not the actual melody, it's still going to sound like a safe variation that I'm creating, right? So that's rule number 1. Always start on one of the chord tones. So even if you're walking into it, like again, a classic bluegrass kickoff is just really walking into those different chord tones. You might have heard something like this, right? Right, so I'm going from one chord tone to another chord tone with a slide. And in that case, I'm adding a passing tone here, right? You might have heard something like this, right? Something like that maybe is a little kickoff. So that I'm starting down here, another chord tone. And I'm sliding into that second chord tone. Last one, a classic kickoff, right? You've probably heard. That one actually goes from a chord tone to a passing tone to a non-scale tone and then into the chord tone, right? So you can see how we're using those different ideas. So whatever key you're playing in, let's say you're playing in a different key, maybe F or D or C, you know, maybe if you're more of a beginner, a key that you're not as comfortable with. You still want to find those chord tones right off the bat, and the easiest way to do that is just take your bar chord, right? So those top 3 notes are going to be your chord tones, right? And you can memorize what those specific notes are, that would be good, but you can also just, again, put down your chord, and each of these options, even the open strings, can be spots to start your solo, right? So let's say I'm in C. Now I could do something like, or I could get up to here, right? Something like that, right? So I have a fairly good chance, 33% right off the top, of just hitting the melody note if I just stay to that rule of picking one of the chord tones to start. Same thing in D, right? I could do, or again, I'm playing with this note, or this note, right? Same notes, just out of a different position. Or something like, or, right? So just taking your chord shapes that you know, wherever you are on the neck, and practice walking into each of those notes. And you can use different lengths of time. You can go longer, you can go shorter. That'll be up to you, depending on how much time you have to fill. But anytime I'm playing a safe solo to start, I'm always going to start with one of those chord tones, right? And even if you're changing chords, right? Let's say I'm going from G to C to D. On the G chords, I'm going to play G chord tones. C, I'm going to play C chord tones. D. And then the other thing I'm doing is now, if I want to make more advanced melodies, I'm going to start connecting them with little passing tones, right? So maybe I do something like this, right? So I did chord tones to start it, 2 chord tones, and then I added this little passing tone right here. And actually kind of right here too, right? Right there, right? So on the C, I added another passing tone. Passing tone into D. So again, another example of using chord tones connected with a passing tone, something like this. Right there, right? So I slid up into my D, and I added this passing tone. So you can see you can start making more advanced melodies when you start adding the passing tones. And you can literally just take your chord tone shapes, and what I recommend is just like start moving one of the fingers around, right? Slide your pinky up, and then kind of trust your ear. It's either going to be a passing tone or a non-scale tone, and as your ear gets better, you'll start to hear that. That's kind of the simplest way, and again, I'm not expecting you to get all this overnight, right? You're going to have to practice this and digest it for a while. But knowing to start on one of those chord tones is so valuable, right? Now you don't have to just pick any note in the scale, right? It's not just memorizing the G major scale and then picking one of those, right? You want those safe notes, the chord tones, and then connecting it with the passing tones. Let's say, so here, I'll give you an example. I'll play in G, but I'll play focusing more on the passing tones, and you'll hear it doesn't connect as much to the chord, right? So let's say I did something like this. It's really hard to tell what chords I'm actually playing there. It sounds like there should be more chords there than I'm actually playing when I was just jamming on G, right? But I was using notes in the G major scale, but I wasn't highlighting the chord tones and then connecting them with the passing tones. I was highlighting the passing tones and then connecting them with the chord tones, right? So you can hear it sounds more quote-unquote outside, where if I do the opposite, I connect the chord tones with passing tones, you'll hear it sounds a lot, again, quote-unquote, safer. So even if I use these notes that are, again, kind of the passing tones, it's all about when you use them, right? It's not just taking the scale and going straight up and down or picking any note in the scale, right? The melody is going to be on those strong chord tones. Even if you can just remember that one simple thing, It's going to improve your playing so much, because I see a lot of players, and I kind of did this myself. It's like, oh, I'm going to memorize all these scales. But think of like the scale is like the alphabet, right? If you just knew the whole alphabet, that's not going to help you necessarily make words, right? If you just randomly throw some letters, what are the chances you're going to make a word that's actually used in the language, right? So again, if you take that idea of the chord tones, that's the spot that's going to help you actually form quote unquote words. Our melody is, in this example or this analogy, is the words, right? So we want to create strong words, not just a random assortment of letters, right? So if we use that idea of chord tones, that's really going to help our playing, regardless of what key we're in. And what do we do when we change chords? Let's say we go to a chord outside of the scale. Let's say we're doing like a G to F, right? So like maybe something like Little Maggie, right? Now I'm going to use my chord tones in the F chord, right? So I might do something like... So now I know where to look for my little melodies on the F chord. It's probably going to be one of these notes, and then I'm still using passing tones, not necessarily from the F major scale, but I'm using passing tones from the G major scale, because that's the key we're in. But now I have those other notes that I can highlight that would technically be outside of the G major scale, but I'm going to highlight those to bring out the new chord that we're playing. Lastly, what you can do is, like I said, there's also non-scale tones, which would be notes outside of the scale. So let's say I'm playing in G. The non-scale tones are going to have the most tension, right? So let's say I'm playing G, but now I choose to highlight that F note. You can hear that F note outside of the scale of tension, or like this B flat note. So I'm not actually going to a B flat chord there, but going to one of those non-scale tones is going to create much more tension. And like I said in the rock climbing analogy, you're not going to want to sit on that note forever unless you're trying to intentionally create a lot of tension, but you're using it as a little passing idea, maybe something like this. Right, so I used a non-scale tone to kick it off to create some tension. And then right here, same thing, I rolled through it. And you can practice it with rolls if you want, or you can practice it with like single string notes. So if you, again, practice what skill you're working on, right? If you're maybe not as, if you just want to work on creating little melodies, maybe you just keep your right hand really simple and you kind of play like single string just to practice that ear training of how those notes are working, right? I'm creating that tension. And then when I go to C, maybe I just go back to chord tones to keep it safe, right? Or maybe I use something more chromatic, right? But you can hear like a little run like that. You want to do it just quickly. You wouldn't want to like hang on one of those notes like this. Right? You can hear if I land on one of those non-scale tones and really like emphasize it, it sounds pretty funky, right? And it sounds like I'm getting out of key, right? Which again, sometimes you can use that to your advantage. But if you think of that analogy of I'm just going to pass through that note quickly, then you can actually use a lot more. You can use any note you want because I'm just passing through it quickly between chord tones. So something like this, right? Right? So I'm adding a lot of notes that technically aren't in the scale, but I'm passing through them quickly. it actually kind of sounds like it does work, right? So again, use these ideas wherever you are on the neck. Let's try some examples up the neck, right? So maybe I take this shape. I'm trying to find like an up the neck break. Same idea. C, G, passing tone right there, right? A classic Scruggs lick. Sliding up to a chord tone, another chord tone, passing tone with like a little bend. So that's using like the scale, passing tone. So all these same ideas work whether you're up the neck or down the neck. Because I think that trips up a lot of people is they think they don't know how to find melodies up the neck. You're still using these same chord tones and shapes, but now I'm just using different passing tones. Something like that, right? Even if you're doing like more melodic stuff, I'm still using that same idea, right? I'm highlighting chord tones. Like in melodic style, you might do a little bit more runs like that. But I'm still almost always starting on a chord tone unless I'm trying to create tension, right? Another thing you'll do in melodic style is like surround chord tones, like. Right, so I'm like taking this note and now I'm surrounding with passing tones. Like if you've ever played like Temperance Reel. Right, so a lick like that. Or up here, right? Right, so that same idea applies whether you're playing in Scruggs style or melodic style or single string. I'm just basically using the concept just slightly differently, right? I might not just hang on like a chord tone up here in melodic style, you know, with like more of like a roll, but I'm gonna take a chord tone and like surround it with other notes. Right, or something like that. I think I've thrown enough at you for one lesson. I don't want you to get overwhelmed, but really just remember that chord tones are the strongest, and then you're connecting them with passing tones to make it more interesting. And if you even want to get a little further out, a little more dangerous, right, then add non-scale tones. If you're ever in doubt, go back to the chord tones. That's where you want to start to look for your melody, right? The chord tones are where the melody is going to start, where the melody is going to end. So if you're looking to play a break on a song you've never heard of, stick to more chord tone style soloing. Use a few passing tones, or maybe throw in a little lick, and then get back to those chord tones. That's going to be the safe spots to hang out while you're figuring out the melody, right? Doesn't mean you're just going to play the melody perfectly on a song you've never heard, but it's again, we're talking about narrowing down the spots to look for the melody, right? You might get a little bit of it, and then at the jam the next time, you get a little bit more of it, right? But if you just take the whole fretboard, it's going to be too overwhelming. There's too much going on in the jam to try and figure out the melody with just nowhere to narrow it down. So you really need to narrow it down. Look to the chord tones first. That's going to be my main spot to start, and then I can expand outward if there's notes that I'm hearing that aren't those chord tones. All right, hopefully that helps you out. Good luck and keep picking. You got this.